Okay, you're ready to go then, Adam. Thank you.
That's great. Well, thanks very much for coming along. So this is the first of a series of seasonal guides to birdwatching in the South Devon Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty. And as it's January, we're going to be focusing on winter. So first of all, I'd just really like to thank Richard Moore. He's a local bird photographer, and he supplied many of the amazing bird images that I'm going to be sharing with you tonight. When I asked Richard, was there anything I could say about him? He said he was a little ugly brickie from the northeast and he'd been living in the AONB for the last 40 years. And his wife says he goes out birding too much. Now, that was really funny, but he's a wonderful photographer. So I'm really going to enjoy sharing some of his images and talking about some of the birds that live in our protected landscape. So, well, we're currently not getting out very much in these surreal times. So I don't really have to emphasize that we really need to just follow government guidelines, take our daily local exercise close to home, keep within social distancing rules, and not to make any unnecessary journeys. Well, depending on where you live, that means that it's going to depend on what birds you see. It's not. So sorry, a slide missed there. There we go. Sorry, there's a slide glitch there. So in terms of the Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty, the best way to find out about us is to go on our website. There's loads and loads of details about the area, and you can find so much about where you can walk. And that's what we're going to be encouraging you to do when we can, is get out there and see some of the wonderful wildlife in our incredible landscape. So the real trick is to actually use our interactive map. There's lots of downloadable walks there. There are some audio tracks and some videos for you to explore. And that might be something you can do while you're locked down. But when things change, you'll be able to get out there and actually find some of these habitats yourselves. So the more habitats that you explore, the more bird species you're likely to see. Tonight, I'm going to have a bit of a focus on gardens. Not only are they really important for wildlife, they're pretty well the only places that you can look at birds at the moment. If you feed birds, obviously you're going to see more. Depending on how rural or where you're actually located, you're going to be able to get to know the birds that are around you. But once again, when we're actually out of this and we can get out into that wider countryside, we have some really, really important habitats. And quite a lot of bird watching is reading the habitats themselves. We've got some unique woodlands. We've got some really special grassland areas as well, not just the agricultural areas, but I'm talking about limestone grasslands perhaps. We have wetlands, some really special wetlands that bring in a whole different suite of birds. And we've got some spectacular coastal habitats. So to be honest, bird watching in our patch is just an absolute joy because we've got some really special places for you to discover. So I think there could be as many as 150 species of birds currently in the AONB tonight. It'd be hard to see them all in one day. It'd be really difficult to see more than 100 species in a day. That's even if the conditions were favourable and you knew where to look. A really good day's birding in the AONB, if we were allowed to travel and we can make the very best use of daylight and possibly going out at night as well, you might be able to catch up with about 80 species of bird. Of those birds, of that so-called 150 species of bird, the largest is the mute swan. It weighs about the same as a car tire, and it has about 25,000 feathers. So that's the largest of the birds that we've got on our patch. And then we've got the smallest of the UK birds on our patch as well, and this is the goldcrest. It weighs about the same as a 20p piece, and it has about 15,000 feathers. So in between the largest and the smallest, we've got this amazing array of different bird species that are out there for you to make friends with. That's the way I perceive it. I see it's one of the ways that I sort of work out how to identify birds. I try and have a relationship with them so that I remember them when I see them again, or I have some sort of mental connection with naming them. But because you're not actually getting out there and exploring the AONB at the moment, I'd like to encourage you to consider the RSPB's Big Garden Birdwatch. So it's happening at the end of the month. In the past, 500,000 people have recorded 8 million birds. It's one of the largest citizen science surveys in the country, and it's free to join. It takes an hour of one of your days just to sit quietly looking out of your window at the birds that are using your garden. Probably find you're doing that already. But I'd just like to point out some golden rules for feeding birds, really. Never put salty foods out for birds. They can't digest salt and it will damage their nervous systems. Only really leave enough food out that can be eaten in one day. Otherwise, you have the possibility of attracting some unwanted visitors like rats and mice. And just like COVID, really, there are sensible hygiene methods for feeding birds. Washing your hands thoroughly when you're filling and washing any of the feeders. There are some diseases that garden birds can suffer from. So if you do decide to join the Big Garden Birdwatch, there's this great array of common species that might visit your garden, especially if you've got food there. You know, winter's a really difficult time for birds. The days are really short. The nights are long and cold. They've got to eat a lot of food in a very short amount of time just to get enough energy to survive until the morning. In addition, at this time of year, the food's harder to find. Many of the insects that they might feed on are hibernating. The grubs that are in our gardens are buried deep in the ground, and the weather can make it harder to find food. There's quite a lot of competition out there, really. So what I'm going to do is, you've probably already identified all of these birds on the Big Garden Birdwatch poster, but I'm going to just go into detail and just go through some of these characters, as I call them. So this is the male chaffinch. It's one of the most widespread and abundant birds in Britain. It's got this highly patterned plumage that helps it blend in when it's feeding on the ground. It confuses predators. But when it flies, it has this amazing revealing flash of white on the wings and white outer tail feathers. You'll rarely actually see it on bird feeders. It usually prefers to hop around under the bird table or under the hedge. You usually hear chaffinches before you see them. That's if you know the call. And the male's got a very simple contact call. He just says, pink, pink, just like his breast. Great birds, the chaffinch. So most garden birds are woodland edge species that have readily adapted to man-made habitats, and they've become familiar visitors and breeders in and around where we live. So this is the great tit. It's a green and yellow bird with a striking glossy black head and white cheeks, and it's got a distinctive 2-syllable song. The great tit often says, teacher, 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 teacher. I do have a friend who says it sounds like a rusty bed spring, but I'll let you decide that when you hear it in the springtime. Although on mild days, great tits might actually start calling and singing themselves. So do keep your ears open in the next couple of weeks if we get a mild spell. Well, this is one of my favourites. It's the blue tit. He's a really cheeky chap. And this colourful mix of blue, yellow, white and green makes it one of our most attractive and recognisable garden birds. Like I say, it's got a cheeky nature about it, really. And at this time of year, they often join other flocks of birds in search of food. If on your garden feeder there are 4 or 5 blue tits, that's usually an indication that you're in fact feeding 20 blue tits, because they go on these little circuits of one garden to the next or one particularly food-rich habitat to the next. So there's this like circuit of birds throughout the day that are moving around like I say, making the best of the daylight hours just so they can get through the night. Well, it's not as colourful as his relatives, but the coal tit has this distinctive grey and a grey back and a black cap. But what's really obvious is the white patch on the back of his neck. He's slightly smaller than the blue tit, and he is a regular visitor to most feeders, but he does have a bit of a habit of being able to store some food. So you'll often see them dashing in, doing a smash and grab job on the peanuts, disappearing, and they'll be hiding them somewhere before so that they can find them at leaner times. So this is pretty easily recognizable for you all. It's the long-tailed tit. It's got quite distinctive pink, black and white colouring. Its tail's bigger than its body, and it has a really undulating flight, and they move around in quite large numbers. Anything as many 20 excitable birds in one flock. Just to survive these cold nights, the long-tailed tits huddle together on a single branch to keep warm. It's the cutest sight you've ever seen, 20 long-tailed tits on a branch huddled together. Here's the UK's favourite bird. We all know what it is. It's a robin. The males and females are identical. And unlike many other species, both male and female robins sing. And they sing all year round. They'll even sing at night next to a streetlight. Well, that all sounds lovely, doesn't it? But really, despite their cute appearance, they're really feisty birds. And the reason they're singing is to protect their territory. And at this time of year, in the winter, they're singing to protect their winter feeding territory. And they'll drive away other intruders. Many of our robins that we see now aren't essentially British robins. They're robins that have come to visit us from Western Europe to spend the winter with us. It's just about now that you might see robins starting their courtship displays. The breeding season doesn't usually start till March, but in a mild winter, this is when they start to pair up, and the birds that are UK birds will pair for just the duration of the breeding season. But it's now that they're thinking about it, and I don't know. I think that's great to think that spring really is just round the corner. This is a quiet and unobtrusive bird that moves rather nervously, shuffling and flicking its wings as it goes. This small grey and brown bird is a hedge sparrow or a dunnock. And you know, you keep your eyes out, you'll see them going around their business, and just being a welcome addition to a garden. I really like looking at dunnocks. They're always doing something interesting. I'll say a bit more about that in my spring talk. So the wren, not much bigger than the goldcrest. It's a tiny bird, and it can, in the winter months when it's really cold, they can look almost round, just with a short, narrow tail cocked up at the back. For a small bird, it's got an incredibly loud voice. At this time of year, it's not in full song at all, but it does have a sort of an aggressive chatter that you might hear occasionally. In fact, it's the most common UK breeding bird. So even though it keeps itself to itself, when it does sing, we'll know about it. Great little characters. They look for places to escape the cold as well. And it has been known that over 40 individuals have been found in a single nest box, all piled together in a great big ball, keeping warm. That's the wren. Well, he's noisy, he's gregarious. It's the humble house sparrow. It can be found almost everywhere on the globe, apart from Antarctica. But sadly, populations in the UK are still declining. And it's exercises like the Big Garden Birdwatch that help us try and indicate otherwise, just to see whether those house sparrow fortunes are changing. It's mainly been changes in agricultural policy, or to a certain extent lack of habitat, or to a certain extent people having better roof insulation. That means that we have less house sparrows around. But like I say, it's citizen science that's going to help us find out how it's doing. This is a bird that we know is doing well. The population's really on the up. This is the goldfinch. It's a highly coloured finch with a bright red face and yellow wing patch. They're really sociable birds. Their collective noun, or for you pub quizzes, is a charm of goldfinches. They could even breed in loose colonies. They've got a beautiful liquid twittering call. And in the winter, many of the goldfinches that we see here have come from elsewhere, because our own goldfinches have migrated south to Spain or southern Europe just for the winter months. I think the greenfinch is often overlooked. They've still got a flash of yellow and green as it flies. They're quite bullish, they're bigger than house sparrows, but it's overlooked. It's a funny old bird, the greenfinch. It's got a twittering, wheezing song, and it has a call that I'll try and describe for you. It says "twee." It's a long, drawn out "twee." It's a funny call, but I do like listening out for it towards the end of March. It's a wood pigeon. It's the largest and commonest of our pigeons. It's essentially grey with a white neck patch and these white wing patches that are really clearly visible in flight. And in November, huge movements of these birds from up country and from Europe fly into our region. Some of these southwesterly movements of wood pigeons have involved over 100,000 birds a day for a whole week. Huge numbers of birds piling into the southwest to take advantage of our warmer climate and the availability of food here. Well, there's a poor old magpie. They've got a bit of a bad reputation, really, because of their challenging, almost arrogant attitude. They're scavengers, predators, and pest destroyers. So in mid-February, we see the gathering of the magpies, the marriage of the magpies, and that happens around the time of St. Valentine's Day. This is where the magpies that are unpaired get together and pair off for the season. Quite romantic, really. Even though they're really chattering, just obvious black and white birds, there's nothing quite like them in the UK. But when you get close up to a magpie, that black plumage takes on an altogether more colourful sort of feeling, with purple and blues and greens all coming through in those feathers. Really worth getting a good look at magpies, and once again, really obvious seeing what they're doing and what they're getting up to. Interesting to see how other birds respond to magpies as well. So once again, I felt it was necessary to just go through with some of our birds that we share our gardens and our lives with. But I'd just like to move on a bit now and do a bit of a circuit of the AONB and talk about our patch, really. So there's about 330 square miles of designated protected landscape. That's the green patch that's there. We've got about maybe 100 kilometers of coastline. And once again, I'd mentioned earlier, we've got some really special, unique habitats within our patch. And in terms of a place that you can go bird watching, what a beautiful backdrop to do it. It's brilliant. So I'll start off at the top right-hand corner there, Elbury Cove and Brixham Harbour, in the northeast of our protected landscape. Bit of a letdown, you say there. So when you go to Elbury Cove, most of the birds that you'll see are distant dots on the horizon in Lyme Bay. So it's one of those places you really need to have a telescope, but there are some special birds there. Just at the moment, in the winter months, we've got divers. This is a great northern diver. We've got species of grebes that dive and feed on the fish and the crabs that hide amongst the offshore seagrass meadows. And it's in these sort of inshore waters that these birds are driven here from all over the north of England and all over Europe to take advantage of the feeding there. And like I say, it is a place that you really do need a telescope to get the very most out of the seabirds in Lyme Bay. But if the weather's right, it's really worth going to have a look at Brixham Harbour. This is a bird called a black guillemot, otherwise known as a tyskie. It's a cracking little bird, really unusual to the area, and it's been brought there because of bad weather. And the divers and the grebes come into the shelter of Brixham in a harbour.
We've just seemed to, Adam's just frozen for a moment. Here he is back.
So moving along from Brixham, you can visit Berry Head, the National Nature Reserve there. It's managed by Torbay Coast and Countryside Trust, owned by Torbay Council. There's some simple good walks around there. You've got a bit of height, you've got some great views over the ocean, and in the summer months it's full of breeding birds, but in the winter months it really is a good vantage point for actually having a look at seabirds. So it just might be a birder thing, but this image doesn't have any seagulls in it at all. In fact, it just contains gulls of different species and ages. I often find birders don't like them being referred to as seagulls. But anyway, the naming and aging of gulls can be very confusing, even for the experts. But even the experts have to use field guides, and I use the Collins Guide to Birds. It's a good book. I don't think there's anything in the UK that you would encounter that's not within the book. And it also describes all the different plumage types. As I said, the gulls, they're a family of very, very confusing birds. The adult great black-backed gull in the middle of that illustration there, the largest gull in the world, is pretty abundant on our coastline. But all of the other herring gulls, the lesser black-backed gulls, the common gulls, the black-headed gulls, they all have different plumage types for their ages and at different times of year. So they can be really confusing, but definitely worth some time trying to pick apart. A great way to impress folk when you can identify a second year lesser black-backed gull at a couple of 100 yards. Well, much easier to identify these large, distinctive white birds. This is an adult gannet, just incredible creatures. They've got this long neck and they've got a really pointed bill, a pointed tail, and pointed wings. They're so dynamic. At sea, they'll flap and then glide and flap and glide quite low over the water, often traveling in small groups quite large distances. But at this time of year, they seem to, the adults are spending time off our coasts, feeding on the large numbers of mackerel and garfish that are on our tidal waters. Just look out for their distinctive splash when they dive into the water. To feed, what they'll do is they'll fly high and they'll circle and then plunge like arrows into the water, getting up to a couple of meters deep to actually get to their quarry before they'll possibly eat it while they're sat on the sea and then digest it for a while. Really good numbers of gannets at the moment. You'll see them with their black wingtips and their big distinctive white bodies off Sholston Pool or from places like Berry Head or Sharkham Point. Really entertaining birds. Well, just moving on away from the seabirds, I'll take you around to Slapton Lee. This is a lagoon on the south coast of our patch. It's separated from Start Bay by a narrow shingle beach known as Slapton Sands. In fact, it's the largest natural freshwater lake in the southwest of England, and it's a great place to go bird watching. The lake's 1.5 miles long. It's within a national nature reserve. It's a site of special scientific interests, and it's made up of two parts, essentially the lower Lee and the higher Lee. But what makes it really good for birds is that mix of habitats, because the lake, just the open water, it's good itself, but it's also surrounded by some great reed beds, some quite interesting marshy areas, and there's some really good woodland habitats there. So just in a in a visit, you can actually get into those habitats and see a really good mix of species. But also you could go for a real icy blast along Slapton Sands, really blow away those cobwebs. And it's a good place to look at wind-blown birds. Almost anything could find itself on those shingle banks. What I do see a lot of is the oyster catcher. This large, stocky, black and white wading bird has a really obvious long and orange-red bill. It's also got reddish pinkish legs. They're really distinctive birds and they make a racket. Their distinctive calls, they go cleeper, 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 cleep, 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 cleeper, and they're just full of character. The bird at the top of the picture there, you can see, has got a white chin strap. That's showing that it's in winter plumage. The two birds that are together to the right of it are in summer plumage. And birds do seem to get a bit confused. Their hormones seem to kick them into different plumage types. And it's about now you do see birds in transitional plumage. I did mention them as wind-blown birds. The actual Slapton Sands itself attracts all sorts of wading birds. The dunlin's the commonest small wader found along our coast. It's got a slightly decurved bill and quite a distinctive black belly patch in breeding plumage. And you'll see from that picture, there's a few of them with a belly patch, there's a few without. Also in the middle of the picture is a ringed plover, those bright orange legs and a really distinctive ring around its neck. Lovely birds. And, you know, there's a really wide range of wading birds that can be found on our patch. Not a bad place to look for them. Well, you know, just to go along there and see some of our common birds close up. Slapton and the little area just by Tor Cross there is worth a look. Good mix of common wetland birds, moorhens, coots, mallards, and many, many more. And those of you that will look onto the lake, we'll see quite a lot of diving birds. There's a tufted duck there. We often see potchard and goldeneye, and currently there's an American ringneck duck spending the winter with us again. But there's also a blackneck grebe there. This all gives us the impression that the lake itself is rich in food source, and a lot of these birds are wintering with us, not just at Slapton but at B Sands as well, a similar lee that is just very close to the coast. But not just that open water, it's that area of reed beds. This is the Phragmites reed, and quite cryptically plumaged. You can see a bittern just flying over the reeds there. It's a very secretive bird, and I think Richard's photograph here is just stunning. How he managed to capture it, I don't know. But the bittern, it's a rare bird. It depends on this habitat and no other habitat. It feeds on predominantly eels and fish, and it would be a real treat to see one. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about the cryptic plumages of birds, and the bitten's pretty obvious here as a reed specialist. But so is this sparrow-sized bird. It's a reed bunting. And once again, it's cryptically plumaged and it just looks like the reeds. So some birds are doing their very best to hide from you. And anyone that's been out there bird watching will think that all birds are out there to hide from you. I always do. It's a real challenge, birding, and especially nowadays when there aren't quite the numbers of birds around that there used to be. This is a challenging bird to see. It's the Chetty's warbler. They've only really been, they're a recent colonist. They've only been in the UK since the early 1970s. And Slapton's a great place to hear it. The song of the Chetty's warbler, which it sings all year round, is a really explosive song. It makes me feel like I want to dance every time I hear it. The Chetty's warbler says, "Chiroo, chiroo, chiroo, choo, 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 choo." And it just explodes with this loud burst of song. And then you'll never see it. Really, really shy. And once again, Richard's caught a photograph of it here. And it's a classic LBJ. It's a little brown job. It's so nondescript. You'd hardly know it was there unless it was for this really loud song. So over time, as your bird watching skills get better, getting to know the calls of birds really helps you locate them. So that's a Chetty's warbler for you. I often hear it by the tank, actually, down at Tor Cross. It's a good place to sit and contemplate and listen out for the Chetty's warbler. So I've been talking a bit about how difficult it is to birdwatch. Well, I've got 4 photographs of what? You can hardly see it's a bird. Some of our birds that are so hyperactive, looking to find food as they flit and dance and hide and jump through hedgerows or the tops of trees. That's one of the most frustrating things for new bird watchers, but for any bird watchers, is trying to see a bird so you can see its plumage characteristics. Does it have an eye stripe? Does it have any bars on its wings? What colour is its legs? It's a real challenge, bird watching, and it's a challenge that I particularly love. But sometimes just knowing the name of a bird, it's not that important. Just enjoying them for what they are. But occasionally, some of these little gems do actually stop and you get a chance to look at them. This is possibly one of my favourite birds. It's the firecrest. It's very similar to the goldcrest, as being one of our UK's smallest birds. And once again, the woodlands around Slapton are a good place to look for it. Its call is very slightly different, although it is just essentially a high-pitched squeak. But when you do see it, it can show itself off like this with its bronze shoulder patches. But occasionally the firecrest will just flash its crest and it'll just blow you away. It's just one of the most beautiful of birds. We're probably the best place in the country to see firecrests, and we really ought to celebrate not only the few pairs that breed here, but the large number of birds that come and visit us. So there's something to look out around Slapton. So I talked about estuaries as being important habitats, and a good place to see an estuary is at West Charlton, and that's the Kingsbridge estuary. There are 5 estuaries in our patch: the Avon, the Dart, the Erm, the Salcombe and Kingsbridge, and the Yelm, and they're defining features of the AONB. They're just incredible places when the tide can reveal shimmering mudflats to wide expanses of water. And once again, they create really good habitats for birds and for birds to feed. It's not just the actual water area itself. We've got salt marshes, we've got more reed beds, we've got these rear oaks, steep-sided oak wooded valleys that go down to the water's edge. We've got our farmland that are patterned with a characteristic fringe of trees. Really worth exploring all of our estuaries. But essentially, at West Charlton, there's a marsh there and there's a birdwatching hide. And from the comfort of a hide and the warmth and possibly a flask of coffee, you can actually just see that changing, evolving landscape in front of you as the tide comes in and out. Birds will change, they'll respond to each other, they'll respond to maybe a bird of prey or a heron, or birds are always interacting with each other. And I do like to have some comfortable bird watching, and to that end we've got some hides across the AONB, and do get in touch if you want to know where they are. We've got we've got a few bird watching hides all over, but in the winter time, sitting in a hide, just letting the birds come to you can be a great way to spend a morning or an afternoon. But also just remember that your house can be a hide. I treat my home as a hide, looking out the back window over the garden. You can use your car as a hide. They can be good places to actually keep out of the elements and keep your binoculars or your telescopes still, or even if you haven't got binoculars or telescopes, just to be able to see how birds are moving through the landscape. So when you're on the estuaries or you're near these wetland habitats, it's going to be obvious that you'll see the grey herons. They're unmistakable. They're tall. They've got long legs. They've got a long beak. They're just quite obvious birds, really. They've got a really wide diet. They'll eat mammals such as voles and amphibians. They'll eat other birds if they get the chance. They're real successful predators, to be honest. And we do have a few heronries. They start breeding very early in the year. There's usually laid eggs by February, and they're going to be in a position where they're going to be feeding the young in springtime. This is our own special heron. This is a little egret, and we see it on many of our estuaries nowadays. They didn't really colonise the UK until the late 80s, so they're a real treat to have as part of our own set of birds around us. Talking about other big birds, the curlew. It's the largest European wading bird, very recognisable with its down-curved bill and brown upper parts and long legs. They've got an amazingly evocative call, and it was once a very common breeding bird in Devon, but sadly there's hardly any left. So the birds that we see have probably come from the Pennines, or they've come from Western Europe. Here's another patch that's worth having a look at for wading birds. It's South Efford Marsh, just near Afton Gifford. There's a bird watching hide there. It's got some salt marsh, some grazing fields, and it's very close to the beautiful winding course of the River Avon. It's managed by the Devon Wildlife Trust, and the levels of water are guided by the tide, and you can see all sorts there. Some of the most obvious wading birds are the redshanks with their bright red orange legs, but it's got a lot of other birds very, very similar to it. There's the greenshank. Can you see? They're almost the same, redshank, greenshank. And to throw in some confusion, there's a lesser yellowlegs. This lesser yellowlegs has been spending the winter with us. It's an American bird, and quite regularly is being seen over recent months at South Efford Marsh. Moving on to other habitats, I want to talk about the Avon Valley. It's a very picturesque area inland in the AONB, and we're involved with projects that aim to restore and reconnect the precious wildlife habitats that are there. So behind me here, you can see a diverse mix of steep ancient woodland. It's on the steep sides of the Avon. There's also areas of new planted woodland there as well. The Avon Valley Woods are owned and managed by the Woodland Trust, one of their first acquisitions. And the woods are brimming with wildlife, to be honest. But it's not just the woods. The area is surrounded by some just fabulous farmland, and the lanes there are edged with high Devon hedge banks, very characteristic landscape forms that are really good for birds. Could be a bit debatable, this. The most obvious bird that you're going to see there are pheasants. These are large, long-tailed game birds that were introduced to the UK from Asia by the Romans a long time ago. But nowadays, they're put down for game shooting, and in the UK 35 million birds, 35 million pheasants are released into the UK countryside. The weight of those pheasants is even larger than all of the other UK birds put together, and it's a bird that you'll see exploding from the side of hedgerows and fields across that whole patch and throughout the whole of the UK. But it's the other farm birds that I'm much more personally interested in. Birds like the stock dove, just a really unknown bird, really, a beautiful call. They nest in the holes of trees. They've got attractive iridescent bottle green bands on the back of their neck and a slightly pink chest. Just wonderful, wonderful birds. Once again, those farmland birds again, there's a male yellowhammer. Absolutely unmistakable, that bright yellow head. They've even got a chestnut rump. Just great birds. And when they start singing, obviously from the top of a hedge or a bush, just a real treat. At this time of year, they all gather together in flocks, and there's some quite good numbers of yellowhammers flocking together at the moment. This is a bird that's understated. What it is when you see it grotting around on the ground in a field, it's a little bigger than a sparrow. It's slightly smaller than a starling. It's essentially brown. But what it's renowned for is its display flight. These are skylarks. They're altitudinal migrants, so birds coming down off the moor and gathering on our coast spend the winter with us. There's currently about 500 of these birds at East Soar, And when they start to disperse again and go into territories, they'll be filling the sky with that incredible song of the skylark. I think it's really important that all of us get the chance to hear skylarks and enjoy them for just their sheer beauty. It's something that I'm always saddened to see the numbers of skylarks dropping. Brilliant birds. Very similar, but not quite so brilliant. It's the meadow pipit. It's a common bird in the upland areas, spends the winter with us down here, a bit similar to the skylark, really. Almost invisible on the floor, but when they fly, they've got a jerky flight and a high piping call when they're flushed. And the meadow pipit is very much an overlooked bird on our farmland areas. This bird's not quite so overlooked. It's the redwing. It's got that creamy strip above the eye, orange-red flank patches, really distinctive, and they roam around the fields and the hedgerows, essentially looking for berries in our Devon hedges. Great birds. Its larger cousin, the fieldfare, has a lovely chuckling call. It's like I say, it's got it's more purposeful is the fieldfare, and I see it as a really attractive part of a winter scene when you see or you hear the fieldfares. Well, sticking to the Avon Valley, down in the combes there's the amazing ancient woodland and other areas of woodland, really worth looking at. And at the moment, there's a local community group spearheading the development of the Primrose Trail so that people get a better access to places like this. So from that access trail there through the woodland, you've got a really good chance of hearing or seeing great spotted woodpeckers. You might come across nuthatches. There's, once again, many of those birds that we might see in our garden are essentially woodland birds. And that's one of the best woodland areas to look out for them. Here's another patch that I'd like to point out. It's South Hewish Marsh. It lies in a shallow valley cut off from the sea behind the dunes at South Milton Sands. The National Trust have handed the management over of this site to Devon Birds, which is a charity that works for the conservation and understanding of birds in Devon. So they've created and managed some scrapes and wetland areas to enable migrant birds to stop off and feed on their huge migrations. And because of the nature of the site, birds are often distant, and it's another one of those telescope sites, sadly. But just going along, you'll see distant flocks of birds wheeling around, or you'll hear a lot of birds calling. This is one bird you will see. It's the teal. It's the smallest British duck. It's about the third of the size of a mallard. And in winter, quite large numbers of these birds congregate in the low-lying wetlands like South Hewish Marsh. Many of them have come from the continent to spend the winter with us. They're birds from the Baltic or Siberia. And there's a whole range of duck species at this site. Widgeon are one of my favourite as they graze on the side of the wetland areas. You might see shovelers, they're great species, and gadwall, and a whole load of dabbling ducks that you really ought to, look at your field guides and just see what beauties they are out there. The area is also quite special for birds that have decided not to migrate. This is a chiffchaff, and it could be seen around the trees and the shrubs and the hedgerows in around that area of South Devon. And in fact, there are more chiffchaffs wintering on our patch than almost anywhere else in the country. This bird, possibly with climate change, is deciding not to migrate to Africa. It's deciding to actually chance it and stay here in South Devon and eke out those short days by finding enough insects to feed upon. But it's not just our own chiffchaffs. There are chiffchaffs from all over. Siberian chiffchaffs are being seen to be wintering here. And so these small little brown jobs, you really do need a field guide to properly identify them. Here's another spot that I'd really like to highlight. It's Prawl Point and Start Point. It's renowned for being the last stronghold of the bird that we call the searle bunting. It's a great little bird, the searle bunting. We're so lucky to have it. Prawl Point was its stronghold in the 1980s. There were less than 100 pairs of this bird in the whole of the UK, and Prawl was its last stronghold. And working with farmers and the RSPB, they've managed to actually change its fortunes. So in the spring, the males with their black chin, eye stripe and crown and yellow stripes on its head make it a really distinctive bird to see. Whereas the more dowdy female does seem to having some success being able to raise its chicks by feeding on targeted habitat improvements that have been funded by agro-environment schemes. And local farmers have really helped this bird survive in this country. And now there are well over 1,000 pairs across the South Hams, and that's a real success story. It's good to have them. Here's a bird that I see quite a lot when I'm at Start Point or wandering around East Prawl. It's the stonechat. It's a robin-sized bird. The males have these really striking black and white and orange plumage. The bird that we can see at the moment is in transitional plumage, so it's not in full summer plumage. They're there flicking their wings and they perch on tops of low bushes. They're not skulkers at all, really easy to find and see. And they utter a really sharp, loud call that sounds like two stones being tapped together. That's where it gets its name from, of course, the stonechat. Another similar bird, robin-sized, is the black redstart. This is a bird that's spending the winter with us along our coastline. There's a few around this year. This individual's on the lighthouse wall at Start Point. Quite distinguished with its bright red tail. Once again, insect eaters that are just about hanging on here because we've got such a mild climate. So when you're out there in the field, you often see small flocks of birds only with a tiny glimpse of colour, and it can be really frustrating, I do know. But if you know their calls, or you've got this idea of what to look for, you can usually put a name to these flocks of birds. These are goldfinches, but they could just as well be linnets or greenfinches, a whole range of small birds that are in flocks across our landscape. People are starting to get involved in something called VisMig, which is the study of visible migration. And because of where we're located, the birds moving all the time, and VisMig in the spring and the autumn is really taking off. And we're starting to recognize what an important patch we live in, and how many birds just actually stop and use the natural resource here to power them on their journeys. There's also something called NOCMIG as well, and that's where people are recording nocturnal migration. Not all birds migrate during the day, some are at night, and we're starting to get some really interesting bits of knowledge about how birds are moving around us. But I think it's quite obvious that for bird watching, we need to look at the sky. And so the commonest bird of prey that we see in our skies really is the buzzard. It's large with broad rounded wings, and it soars on a shallow V-shaped. They're really variable in colour. And one of the buzzards down at Slapton at the moment is almost white. Another really big bird, in fact, it's heavier and bigger than a buzzard, is the raven. They're just great birds, and you often hear a raven before you see one. Their calls are like a grunting pig. They're even described as they cronk or they quack, and they even make some strange bell-like calls, and they never fail to surprise me. Really great birds, and they're doing really well in the AONB. This is one of the most dynamic birds of prey that we like to see in our skies. It's the peregrine falcon, the fastest British bird. And we have a few pairs along our coast, and they're often scudding along our landscapes, scaring other flocks of birds, and you often find peregrine kills as well. Anyone that finds a decapitated bird on a cliff walk, it's very likely it's going to be a peregrine kill. Sparrowhawks, once again, they're doing quite well. They've got bright yellow orangey eyes that from quite a height will spot a chaffinch, or they'll spot a meadow pipit or some small bird in the hedgerow or on a field, and they'll dash through and do a surprise attack. And it's that whole dynamic system out there of predators and prey and the need for these birds to survive. And sadly, the kestrel numbers aren't what they used to be. These are birds that hover in the sky. So any bird that you're likely to see almost motionless above you on any of our sites are likely to be kestrels. So I've done my best to throw in a little bit about identifying birds. We have, like I say, we have so many here. It's far from comprehensive. I will try and open myself up to see if I can help you put a name to some of the birds that you might have seen, or you have a memory of, or even better, if you have a photograph of. A fisherman recently sent me a picture of a bird he'd seen. He didn't know what it was, even though a lot of these people spend a lot of time outdoors, and he didn't know what it was. And it was this. It's an albino great northern diver, and it's just been spending the last couple of weeks in the harbour at Salcombe. There's never been a bird like this in the UK, as far as I know. Just an absolutely stunning creature. So, expect the unexpected is what I say. But do feel that you can contact me and ask me questions about the birds you see. But just lastly, I'd like to say that a lot of our habitats are being fragmented, and a lot of mobile species don't seem to be able to move through the landscape as they used to. And it's really important that we try and join these places, improve habitats, and give birds a much better chance to survive here. And Devon Birds, they have conservation days. This is at South Milton Lee, where we're doing some reed bed management. The National Trust have volunteers where you can get involved in practically changing the environment around us. So maybe you'd like to consider that. And just for more information, I do want to signpost you to our website so that you can get the very most out of our patch. Have a look at Devon Birds as well. There's some great information there and some real up-to-date stuff. You can even find out what birds have been seen today. But more than anything, I just think, when we can get close to people again, talk to people that are wearing binoculars. And if you wear binoculars, you'll probably end up having people coming up to you and asking you what you've seen or anything interesting about, or possibly asking you for some tips on bird watching. So we're nearly there now, really. I'd just like to say thanks very much for listening today, and also just to say that my next seasonal guide is going to be in the spring, and I've got all sorts to tell you about the magic of the dawn chorus, a bit more about the journeys that some of the birds have made to actually come to spend the summer with us at the busiest time of year, the breeding season. So thanks once again.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Could you please stop sharing your screen?
Yeah.